when I go to China, that I feel like I am among my people. I've told some people that when I start my talks in China, I say, it's good to be among my people. Now, I want you to understand, I do not speak a word of Chinese. I feel like I am really in a foreign culture when I go to China, but intellectually, I'm at home in China, much more so than I am when I go to Washington, D.C., certainly when I'm on university campuses, because the Chinese are realists to the core, right? This is true of the Russians as well. You go to Moscow, you talk to the Russians. So I think if you talk about a natural alliance, in my opinion, the natural alliance was the United States and Russia against China. But the end result is that we're not going there. We've now pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. The question is, who knows? Do you know what I'm saying? Who knows what the Russians will do? They clearly believe they face an existential threat. Who knows what we would have done during the Cold War if the Soviets or the Warsaw Pact was overrunning West Germany? Just very hard to say. That's what makes the situation so dangerous.
我们刚刚看到的是3年前，2022年11月8日，世界知名的国际关系学者米尔斯海默在匈牙利一场演讲结束后的问答环节片段。在那场活动中，面对来自观众的犀利提问，米尔斯海默将他的现实主义理论直接应用于当今世界最棘手、最危险的几个问题之上。3年过去了，当我们今天再回看这段对话，会发现他当时的许多分析不仅没有过时，反而更具现实意义。在接下来的内容中，你将听到他对一系列核心难题给出的不加掩饰的坦率回答。世界是否正在分裂为新的东西方两大阵营？美国一个堪称灾难级的战略失误，是如何亲手将他的两个最大对手中俄推到一起的？核战争的风险有多真实？它将为我们推演2种最可能爆发核战争的场景，以及当自由主义的幻想在残酷的现实面前破灭时，为什么他说现实主义回来了？这不仅是一场学者与观众的互动，更是一次帮我们看清当今世界底层逻辑的思想碰撞。让我们继续。
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just following up on your summary at the end, do you foresee a scenario in the world where the West and the East will be completely separated economically, technologically? There will be very, very limited trade, like as during the Cold War era.
Tell me what you mean by the West and the East. I mean,
The West mostly driven by the US and the East led by China. I had a previous question to that, but partly maybe your presentation answered that. That was, if the US considers China as a peer competitor, wouldn't it make sense for the US to have a strong ally in form of Europe, and not weaken them against the Russia conflict when China is the real peer competitor? But now I kind of felt like you were saying...
Okay, good. I should have understood your question to begin with. Let me start by saying that if you're the United States of America and you're in a multipolar world, and China is a peer competitor and a potential regional hegemon, and Russia is a weak great power, it's in your interest to have Russia as an ally, okay? And what the United States should be doing is it should be minimizing the forces that it has in Europe and forming an alliance with Russia so that Russia is part of the balancing coalition against China. That's what we should have done. But instead, what has happened is we have picked a fight with the Russians. The Russians are now a mortal enemy, and we have pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And we have gotten more deeply involved militarily in Europe than was the case during the unipolar moment. This is at a time when we should be pivoting to Asia. You know all the emphasis the Americans put on pivoting to Asia? It's very hard to pivot to Asia when you're increasing your commitment in Europe. So we're increasing our commitment in Europe, and we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This gets to your question. I think that what's happening here is we are, for the foreseeable future, moving to a world where you have the Russians and the Chinese on one side, the Iranians and the North Koreans as others, and others as well, right? And then on the other side, you have the Americans, the West Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Australians, the so-called West. So I think you are getting, I wouldn't have thought to call it an East-West divide, but that's a good term. You are getting something of an East-West divide here. And remember what we were talking about with regarding to economic intercourse in Europe. It looks like Russian-European economic intercourse is going to dry up in large part in the years ahead. It's already happening, which would just reinforce the point that I'm making. So I think, yeah, this is what's happening. And I think from an American point of view, it's not in our interest, because again, it would be in our interest to have an alliance with the Russians. By the way, just look at the Iranians. The Americans have this thing about Iran where we constantly, right, talk about how evil the Iranians are. We're unwilling to, reach any form of meaningful agreement with them, and so forth and so on. And what we've in effect done with the Iranians is driven them into the arms of the Russians. The Russians are getting all sorts of drones and ballistic missiles from the Iranians that are invaluable in their war in Ukraine. And that's because the Iranians have a vested interest in working with the Russians, because the Americans have their gun sights on Iran. I don't think that's smart either.
Hello, I wanted to ask you about the option of nuclear escalation again, in terms of the scenario where we presume that American boots are on Ukrainian soil. So you argued that as that option would be seen by Russia as an existential threat, it's a potential for the usage of nuclear weapons, but I would presume that in a Russian nuclear strike in which there are American casualties, that scenario would warrant a similar response. So is it wrong to presume that maybe mutually assured destruction is a strong enough force to prevent the usage of nuclear weapons even in such a radical situation? Like, say, as long as Russia's territorial integrity is not directly threatened.
Yeah, another great question. Let me just say a few words about nuclear use, the different scenarios. The most likely scenario at this point in time where Russia uses nuclear weapons would be in Ukraine. If Russia is losing the war in Ukraine, it would be tempted, at least, powerfully tempted, to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine against Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian targets. So in that case, the United States would not be involved, NATO would not be involved, and we would therefore not have to retaliate. This is one of the reasons that I'm very nervous that the Russians may use nuclear weapons if they're losing in Ukraine. Because if they're losing in Ukraine, they can use nuclear weapons inside Ukraine with a low risk that the Americans will hit them with nuclear weapons, okay? So that's one possibility. Now, the other possibility is that if the Russians, if the Americans get involved in the war, that NATO gets involved in the war, the Russians are likely to use nuclear weapons. This is what Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, said, and I think she's correct. So the Americans get involved. Now, this is where your logic kicks in, right? So the Americans come in. It's a conventional war against the Russians. It's a conventional war. And my argument was the Russians would use nuclear weapons. I'm following in the footsteps of Avril Haines, likely to use nuclear weapons. That's the scenario. Your question is the threat of mutual assured destruction, which is certainly there. You're absolutely right. It's sitting in the background. Both sides, apropos this gentleman's question, both sides have the ability to turn the other side into a smoking, radiating ruin. Okay, that's mad, mutual assured destruction. Does that mean, this is his question, does that mean the Russians won't use nukes because they don't want to get incinerated? Of course, they don't want to get incinerated, but the way around that, and this was NATO policy during the Cold War, is you launch a small number of nuclear weapons against the other side. And you make it clear you're now out on the slippery slope to oblivion. This is what Thomas Schelling called the manipulation of risk. You all understand, just to go back to the Cold War, I'm NATO. The Warsaw Pact is coming into West Germany. NATO's forces collapse, okay? NATO has said, this is Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, that we will then countenance using nuclear weapons. And we had thousands of nuclear weapons in Europe, in Germany. We would use those nuclear weapons against the Warsaw Pact. How did we think about using them? We thought about a limited use of nuclear weapons because we wanted to avoid mutual assured destruction. And what we do is we launch a handful of nuclear weapons, reminding the Russians, the Soviets during the Cold War, that in the background is that mad capability. And if this one spins out of control, we're all going to get incinerated. So our belief was a handful of nuclear weapons, manipulating risk, would convince the Soviets to pull back. Whoa, the Americans are deadly serious here, right? Now, a lot of people said we would never use nuclear weapons even if the Soviets were overrunning Germany, because we, the Americans, and even the Europeans, we don't want to get incinerated. And that's the implication of your question. Maybe the Russians, contrary to what John says, won't use nuclear weapons if the Americans get involved, because even if they use them in a limited way, there is the danger it'll spin out of control and we'll all be vaporized, right? So we won't use them. And in this story, the Russians won't use them either. The question is, who knows? Do you know what I'm saying? Who knows what the Russians will do? They clearly believe they face an existential threat. Who knows what we would have done during the Cold War if the Soviets or the Warsaw Pact was overrunning West Germany? Just very hard to say. That's what makes the situation so dangerous. But again, the 2 points I'm making to you is you want to remember the first scenario is that the Russians use nuclear weapons inside Ukraine. And there, the threat of MAD is tiny. The second scenario is the Americans get involved. The Russians use nukes against the Americans, but they do it in a very limited fashion, thinking they can avoid MAD, but use MAD to convince the Americans and NATO to back off. That's how I think about nukes.
Hello, hi. So I really have an interesting question as to, in your whole speech you were talking about this mobile, let's say, mobile polarity in our international society. So the question goes as follows. So we are living in a world in which, according to the Western hemisphere, in a Western perspective, you mentioned that there is this competition among like U.S. and the U.S. and Russia, but in the differentiation of the U.S. with China. So I would like to ask, from a Western perspective, would it be wise to consider that China and Russia could form a natural alliance, or should we consider Russia and China as a unified threat to Western security? That would be my question. And the argument I would use to follow up this question would be that that's my question. It would be wise to count Russia and China as a natural alliance.
My experience going to Moscow before the Ukraine crisis blew up was that the Russians could not understand why the United States was picking a fight with Russia when it made eminently good sense for the United States and Russia to be allied. The Russian perspective was that historically, China and Russia had been mortal enemies on a number of occasions. When I was young, back in 1969, they fought a series of battles out in the Siberia area, and there are all sorts of potential disputes between the Chinese and the Russians. And Russians, in recent years have said to me, we are your natural allies. We are not a threat to take over Europe. And why aren't you forming an alliance? So I think if you talk about a natural alliance, in my opinion, the natural alliance was the United States and Russia against China. I will just point out to you that I had a number of Russian friends, very smart young Russian strategists actually, who said to me, John, you think about US-Russian relations in a binary fashion, which is wrong-headed. I used to talk about whether Russia should be allied with the United States or Russia should be allied with China. And that's what I've done here tonight, just for simplicity's purposes. But their argument was, these were young Russian strategists, their argument was that the ideal strategy for Russia was to sit on the fence and not get involved either with the Chinese or with the United States. And in a very important way, that's sort of what I was describing as the Hungarian approach to dealing with the United States and the West and Russia on the other hand, trying to play both sides of the fence. These young Russian strategists, very smart, said to me that this was the way that Russia should play its hand, not get too closely involved with the United States. And I had to admit that I hadn't even thought of that, and I think that they were right. But the end result is that we're not going there. We've now pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. No. Yeah, continue. I'm fine.
Thank you. My name is Miklos Kovács. You and together with other realists are very respected, but nevertheless a minority of the international relationship establishment, let's say. Do you see any chance that your view became dominant? In your view, realism in international politics as a school comprise minority within the... So my question is, you see any chance that your view became dominant?
There is no question that realism is a deeply hated theory of international relations in the United States. It's very, very tough to be a realist in the United States. I've told a number of people here that when I go to China, that I feel like I am among my people. I've told some people that when I start my talks in China, I say, it's good to be among my people. Now, I want you to understand, I do not speak a word of Chinese. I feel like I am really in a foreign culture when I go to China. And it's one of the few times when I am conscious of the fact that I'm an American. Most of the time, I come to Hungary, I don't think of myself, in nationalistic terms. I don't think of myself as an American, right? Part of the West, that sort of thing. When I go to China, I feel very much like I am in a foreign culture. But intellectually, I'm at home in China, much more so than I am when I go to Washington, D.C., certainly when I'm on university campuses, because the Chinese are realists to the core, right? This is true of the Russians as well. You go to Moscow, you talk to the Russians. Go to Iran. I was in Iran in 2018. These countries are filled at the top with people who are realists, and even in the universities. This is not true in the United States. Now, take this a step further. During the unipolar moment, remember what I said about the unipolar moment? There was only one great power by definition, and I said, you therefore cannot have great power politics. So it was really easy to dismiss realism during the unipolar moment. And the end result is that you got liberal hegemony. This is what my book is all about. The book that has been translated by these folks here and by Attila, right? The book is all about liberal hegemony during the unipolar moment. The problem is, from the liberal perspective, we're now in a multipolar world. Great power politics is alive and well. And there's no way the United States can avoid behaving like a realist great power. Realism is back. And I want to give you one example to highlight that. But before I do, you still never want to lose sight of the fact that even though the United States will act like a realist great power, it will put a velvet glove of liberalism over its realist fist to make it look like we're not really behaving in realist fashion. But we will. But here's the example I want to give. Joseph Biden was the vice president of the United States under Barack Obama. This was during the unipolar moment. And during the unipolar moment, we pursued a policy of engagement with China. I referenced this in my talk. We foolishly helped turn China into a great power. We foolishly helped turn China into a peer competitor. Every single administration, Republican and Democratic, from basically 1989 up until 2017, participated in that enterprise, Republicans and Democrats alike. Joseph Biden, as vice president, was a huge proponent of engagement, which is a thoroughly liberal policy, okay? Donald Trump comes into office. As I say in the book, Donald Trump explicitly ran against liberal hegemony. Furthermore, he moved into the White House when the world was turning multipolar, and therefore Trump approached China in a realist fashion. There's no question about that. He abandoned engagement. He explicitly abandoned engagement, this liberal policy, and he adopted a realist approach toward China, okay? Then Trump is defeated in 2020, and who becomes president? Joe Biden. He has a track record, engagement. The question you have to ask yourself is, when Biden becomes president, does Biden go back to engagement, liberal policy, or does he follow in the footsteps of Donald Trump and even toughen up our balance of power approach to dealing with China? The answer, as you surely know, is that Joe Biden does not go back to engagement, and one can easily argue that Joe Biden has been tougher on the Chinese than Donald Trump was. So Trump was clearly the guy who flipped the policy from engagement to realpolitik, but Joe Biden is following in his footsteps. But nevertheless, if you listen to the Americans talk about the competition between the United States and China, they don't describe it in balance of power terms. They don't describe it in the terms that you heard me describe it in here in my lecture. They describe it as an ideological fight between authoritarian regimes and liberal regimes. Right? It goes back to that gentleman's question in the rear before about the East-West divide. We in the West, especially in the United States, define it in liberal terms. We have this very Manichean view of the conflict. They're the good guys, liberal Democrats. They're the bad guys, authoritarian states. And we're involved in this deep-seated ideological struggle. But I would argue that this is crazy. China was a communist state when we were playing kissy face with it, when we were involved in engagement. China's political system is not changed. What changed was the balance of power. But anyway, that's an excellent question.
Okay. Nem tudom, annyian jelentkeznek, már sajnos az időből kifolytunk. Kisasszony, egy hölgy kérdezőnk is legyen. Egyébként utána a kérdések után lesz módja annak, aki megvásárolta a professzor úr könyvét dedikálni. Tehát aki esetleg még akar, az vehet kint ezelőtt érve könyvet is dedikálhatja. Kisasszony.
Thank you so much for the great lecture tonight. Your thoughts really made me wonder about Europe, and actually I was wondering in the politics of the great powers, how do you see the role of Europe? Are we actually an ally to save, let's say politically and economically, or are we actually just a collateral damage, let's say in the eyes of the US? Thank you.
Well, as I said before, I mean, I think you can talk about Europe. You know, you can talk about Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. You can use these terms, but it's important to understand always that they are collections of states. As I said before, nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet, and it guarantees that the nation state is alive and well. Over the years, this goes back to when I was a graduate student, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, right? People talk about the withering away of the state. The state's going to wither away, and we're going to live in a world of no states. This is not going to happen, right? States are here to stay. And when you talk about Europe, you're talking about a collection of different kinds of states. Just think about Hungary and Poland. Just think about Hungary and the extent to which Hungary is different in terms of thinking on how to deal with Russia today compared to most other European states. There's just a lot of differences between the Hungarians and other states, the Hungarians and the Poles. Think about how the French reacted to the German chancellor going to Beijing. The French were irate. So you have all these different states, and therefore I always find it very difficult to talk about a concept like Europe as if it were a nation state. And then just to take this a step further and build on some earlier comments that I also made in the Q&A, I actually think nationalism is going to go up all across Europe. You know, Hungary and Poland have been anomalies in Europe in recent years. If you're in the United States, you talk about what countries in Europe have seen nationalism flourish. People will automatically say there are two countries, Poland and Hungary. I believe that nationalism is going to flourish in many more European states. And this is over time, in large part because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I believe the end result of that is these institutions like the European Union and NATO, which allows someone like you to talk about Europe, right? Europe means the EU for lots of people. I think it's just going to be tougher to do that with the passage of time. I could be wrong on that. As I said earlier, if I am wrong and Europe is united and there is this thing called the European nation state, the Americans will put their gun sights on that European state. Because we don't tolerate peer competitors. Just very important to understand that. Now, liberals would argue that's wrong, by the way. Liberals would say that democracies don't fight other democracies. Democracies don't engage in security competition, okay? This is the argument. Therefore, a United States of Europe would certainly be a liberal democracy, and the United States is a liberal democracy, and we can live happily ever after. That's the liberal view. You all understand, just to go back to China, here was the basis of engagement, okay? When we were feeding the beast, and China was getting more and more powerful, and I was saying, this is crazy, people would say engagement's going to work. And this is how engagement works. We integrate China into the world economy, and we make China rich. We make it prosperous, which of course we did. Number two, we integrate it into international institutions like the WTO, right, the IMF, the World Bank. We make it, this was Robert Zoellick's words. These were Robert Zoellick's words. We make it a responsible stakeholder. Think about those words, a responsible stakeholder. You make it a law-abiding or a rule-abiding state by integrating it into institutions, right? So it's prosperous, it's a rule-abiding state, and then what will happen is China will turn into a liberal democracy. Right? Because when you become prosperous, you become rich, and you're surrounded with all these other rich countries in these institutions. You democratize. And once China democratizes, we'll live happily ever after. That's the liberal theory of international politics known as democratic peace theory. My view, as you would expect, is, first of all, you can't be sure that they'll democratize. Second, even if they democratize, you can't be sure that they won't backslide. And third, even if they democratize and stay democratic, you can't know their intentions. And therefore, you do not want to take a chance. But you just couldn't make that argument, because getting back to your question, this gentleman in the front here, liberalism was such a powerful ideology during the unipolar moment. This, again, is the subject of my book. That those were really tough times for someone like me to get up before an audience like you and make a realist argument, because people thought the world had changed. You've all read Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece. For those of you, the younger people in the crowd, if you haven't read Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, The End of History, which was published in 1989 in the National Interest, you should really read it, and read it carefully. It's an article, I think it's the most important article that has ever been written in the United States in terms of influencing foreign policy and influencing how the American foreign policy elite thinks. I believed at the time that it was a remarkably foolish argument, and that it would be proved wrong, and I do believe it has been proved wrong. But it's an argument that says we, the United States, played the principal role in defeating fascism in the first half of the 20th century. And then in the second half of the 20th century, we played the principal role defeating communism. And now the only viable political system that was left was liberal democracy. And in fact, what was going to happen with the passage of time was that the entire planet would end up being comprised of liberal democracies. Liberal democracy was the wave of the future. In a way, what Frank was saying in this famous piece is that the Americans have the wind at their back. History is on our side, even though he was talking about the end of history, right? We have the wind at our back. And Frank said that once the planet is populated with nothing but liberal democracies, there'll be no war, there'll be no conflict of any consequence. And he says explicitly in the piece that the biggest problem that we will face is boredom. Just think about that. And this line of argument is what underpinned engagement. The idea was that if you engage with China, right, the end result would be that China would become a liberal democracy, and again, we'd live happily ever after. NATO expansion. Most of you young people in the audience probably don't appreciate this, but NATO expansion up until 2014 was not aimed at containing Russia. It was designed to spread the liberal political order and economic order that had been established in Western Europe during the Cold War into Eastern Europe. This is why Vladimir Putin was invited to the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit. NATO expansion into Ukraine was not designed to contain Vladimir Putin. I told you, he was viewed as remarkably weak. Russia was viewed as remarkably weak, and we were trying to push NATO expansion down the Russians' throat, right? So what we were doing was, it was liberal hegemony. We wanted the Hungarians to join NATO and to join the EU, because you would then be joining institutions and you would become rule-abiding citizens. Furthermore, if you joined the EU, you got integrated into Western Europe, you become prosperous. And you did become prosperous. And furthermore, we wanted to make sure you became a liberal democracy. Many Hungarians, of course, complain bitterly about the fact that the Americans and the West, more generally, are trying to push liberalism on them. Yes, but that was part of the strategy, right? Liberal democracy in Hungary, prosperous Hungary, Hungary that's embedded in institutions. This is what we wanted to do with Ukraine. It's what we wanted to do with Poland, right? And the idea was, once we did that, we'd all live happily ever after. The real monkey wrench in the operation were the Russians, right? And we didn't think the Russians mattered that much. The Bush Doctrine in the Middle East. The Bush Doctrine was designed to turn the Middle East into a sea of democracies. When we invaded Iraq, we thought that Iraq was not the last stop on the train line. We thought we'd have to do Syria, maybe Iran, but eventually everybody would see how powerful we are, throw their hands up, surrender, and the Middle East would democratize. Frank Fukuyama told us that was going to happen. Fascism was dead, communism was dead, authoritarian governments, nah. We're talking about liberal democracy here, there, and everywhere. And this is the road that we went down. And it was a disaster, right? NATO expansion led to the war in Ukraine. in my opinion, as I laid it out here. The wars in the Middle East to foster democracy, they worked out really well. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, geez, the amount of murder and mayhem that we helped create in the Middle East. And China, we created a peer competitor, right? This was liberal hegemony. But the point I made is that that's in the rearview mirror now. Rhetorically, it's not, because that's the velvet glove. You want to remember, the Americans will continue to talk like liberals and act like realists, because we're playing hardball now, because we have two great power adversaries, and we're in a very dangerous situation.
我们刚刚听完的就是米尔斯海默对当今世界最尖锐问题的坦率回答。他用冷酷的现实主义逻辑，为我们揭示了地缘政治的残酷真相。他清晰地指出了几个核心要点。第一，他确认了新冷战的到来，并直言不讳地指出，美国将俄罗斯推入中国怀抱的政策，是导致这一局面的灾难性失误。第二，他严肃地警告了核战争的真实风险，并通过对乌克兰战争的两种场景推演，清晰地告诉我们，相互确保摧毁的威慑在特定情况下是可能失效的。第三，他宣告了现实主义的回归，论证了在残酷的大国竞争面前，国际体系的结构力量最终会压倒所有自由主义的幻想。他还明确指出，从美国国家利益出发，最理性的战略本应是联合俄罗斯，共同制衡中国。然而，美国的政客们被他所批判的自由主义霸权幻想冲昏了头脑，反其道而行之，同时在欧洲和亚洲开辟了两条战线，愚蠢地将中俄推到了一起。可以说，正是美国的战略失误，为中国赢得了极其宝贵的战略机遇期。如果华盛顿的精英们真的听从了米尔斯海默的建议，那么中国今天所面临的国际环境将会困难得多。如果你认为这期节目对你有价值，请点赞、评论、分享、订阅我们的频道。感谢你的观看。